The conflict in Western Equatoria State is intensifying as different groups are arming themselves. What is being done to resolve the conflict? Join us as we discuss this and more only on Beyond the Headlines. Our guest on the program is Mr. Edmund Yakani, the Executive Director of Community Empowerment for Progress Organization, abbreviated as CEPO. Mr. Yakani has extensive experience in research on security sector reform, governance, human rights, rule of law, and gender. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me for a second time for the program.
The conflict in Western Equatoria State is reported to have taken a tribal dimension between the Azande and Balanda. Is that the case? Also, can you update our viewers who did not watch our last interview as to what started the whole conflict within the state?
Thank you very much. And to bring to the attention of your viewers who might have not listened to our previous interview is that the situation in Tombura, if you see from a public angle, people say it's Azande and Balanda fighting, which I myself being in one of the mediators of the conflict on the ground, I come to discover actually it is a really high political motivated violence in which the praise of Zande and Balanda is being used to cover it up and to keep it remain as a conflict that is described as inter-communinal violence. But I feel the conflict in Tombura, it's a proxy war between the SPLA-IO and the SSPDF. But obviously, the two ethnic groups take sides with the one either of the two. So you come to realize that the Balanda more lean to the IO and the Zandes are more lean to the SSPDF. And this is mainly based on personalities that are the commanders of the fighting force on the ground. So that's how it tuned to be like a Balanda and Zande. But if you see the consequences of the violence in Tombura, it affects Zande and Balandas equally. So it's really not a Balanda-Zande tension. It is a political elites-led violence that is associated with the question of power sharing and administration of public affairs in Tombura County, which is shared between the Balandas and the Zandes.
And who are the leaders or commanders who are fueling this conflict?
Of course, previously you have what is called the armed Balanda youth, and you start questioning why you have an armed Balanda youth. And you have also the armed Zande youth, and you start asking who are these Zande armed youth. So you come to realize from the Zande side is you have General James Nando, who was by then a deputy of the current governor of Western Equatoria Futuyo, who defected from SPLA-IO and joined the SSPDF. So James Nando is actually an SSPDF. So he's heading the front of the Zande. And from the angle of the Balandas, you have names which have been moving around. You couldn't really qualify, but right now, one particular single name have come out very clear. Somebody who is called Angelo Davido, who is actually a Zande, but then under the administration of the paramount chief of Tombura, who is also a Zande, is now leading what is called the Balanda Armed Youth, but his forces are mixed of Balanda and Zande. So you have Angelo Davido from one side fighting James Nando from the other side, and James Nando is more associated with the Zande and SSPDF, who have left Tombura last 2 days ago, and later on I can update your viewers. Then Angelo is the one fighting James Nando, and Angelo it's a Zande deputized by a Balanda in the group. And when normally hear the word armed Balanda youth, those are the forces under Angelo Davido, who is completely a Zande by tribe, but he's deputized by Balanda, but they have a mixed force of Balanda and Zandes. So when you see in terms of proxy, Angelo Davido become more of lean to IO, and James Nando, who is a Zande, more lean to SSPDF. So that's how the proxy war is being described on the ground. But what they do is that the elites who fuel that, who they may be either based in Juba or based in Yambi or based in Tombura, start using the language Balanda Zande war, simply to at least distance them from being like direct players who are fueling the violence on the ground in Tombura.
And what is the involvement of the governor of Western Equatoria State in the whole conflict, Governor Futuyo?
Obviously, Governor Futuyo is at fixed. in the sense that he is a governor who governed the state. And for the first time, he's a governor coming from the ethnic group of Balanda and an IO. And he is in the face of challenging his former deputy who defected and joined SSPDF, and that's James Nando, who have undergone integration into SSPDF in Meridi. So Futuyo is at fixed here, whether he takes side with James Nando or he takes sides with Angelo Davido, he's at fixed. So he keep on blaming whoever wage an attack per the day. So if it's Nando wage, immediately find that strictly he challenged Nando. If it's Davido, he quickly challenged Davido. But the whole game is that Governor Futuyo is at fixed at a position that he need to really take responsibility in taking action for demilitarization of Tombura. And of course, demilitarization of Tombura, it has to be done by a mechanism which was designed by the peace agreement called Joint Defense Board, JDB, who is currently now in Tombura. And unfortunately, as per our last interview, when I talk about demilitarization, as I'm talking to you, they have never ever made an effective move in demilitarizing Tombura, though we hear reports that one particular party like IO forces have been moved out. But if you see the people who are moved out are mainly children and women, and you start asking, what about these so-called armed groups of youth of Balanda and this armed group of Zandes?
Yes, we're going to come on the issue of demilitarization because it's so important and critical to really stabilizing the state. Now, the chief named Chief Sebit Cornelio, the interim Balanda chief in Tombura County, released a press statement in which he stated the following. On the behalf of Balanda community of Tombura and Western Equatoria State, and on my own behalf, I would like to make it clear to the public that the ongoing conflict in Tombura, where Balanda community is blamed for, is not Balanda making. Rather, Balanda are in position to defend themselves from the deliberate ethnic cleansing violence strategy by our Azande brothers, and in particular, the Avungara clan within the Azande community, whom we have shared blood vows with and have been living with them for centuries as in-laws, friends, and uncles. Now, according to the statement by Chief Sebit Cornelio, the Balanda are being blamed for instigating the conflict. Has that been the case in what's happening on the ground right now?
Obviously, currently on the ground, the armed groups are following ethnic loyalty. So easily you can hear even a formal statement of a government of the state can say Balanda armed group, Zande armed group in terms of the youth. So it starts that naming itself, it's real problematic. And I think this particular statement from the interim chief was responding that when you talk of the Balanda armed youth have attacked the Azande, then the element is that Balanda is causing ethnic cleansing against the Zande. So Balanda escaping that from the statement of the chief by saying, no, we are not really waging an ethnic cleansing, but we have been attacked by our fellow Zandes in terms of like, they want to clear us out of Tombura. While the actual problem that between Zande and Balanda is completely political, it's about power sharing in the administration of Tombura at level of local government, at seat of a commissioner and a seat of a paramount chief. And remember, as I've mentioned in the first interview, the seat of paramount chief in Tombura, it's a kingdom which is naturally inherited. So the Balandas in history was of chief. They can't take the seat of the paramount chief, but they are trying to rescue local. Let us have rotational responsibility sharing. That's the trigger of the conflict. So what I've seen is clearly that the Zandes are in confrontation with the Balandas, proxily supported by either the IO or the SSPDF, but this particular ethnic or this particular section of the Zandes they mentioned, the Avungara. The Avungara is a section of the kingdom of the Zande, whether being in Tombura or in Yambio under the Tombura kingdom and then the Budwe. But I think that brought for you an attention that actually the whole ethnic group of Zandes are under attack or they're in confrontation with their counterparts, Balandas. But this particular tension is completely political motivated. Some political elites are using that to change the history and to pave their way to power.
Now, for some of us who might not be familiar with the significance of the position of a paramount chief, because it seems very ancient. What is the significance of having that position of a paramount chief within the kingdom of the Azande? And why is it so important for the Balanda who want to take on that position of a paramount chief? What is the significance of the roles of a paramount chief in administration affairs, basically?
Basically, if you know about the context of what is called traditional authority, it's a layer of public governance at community level that have huge power to mobilize and to shape the opinion of the public. So the seat of the paramount chief, it is a royal seat that gives somebody the privilege to direct the opinion of the communities, even if you're educated. If your paramount chief say, our opinion and our position is this, with your PhD, if you graduate from London, this PhD of U.S. cannot challenge the opinion of the paramount chief. So it is an authority at a community level, at a traditional level, that shapes position of a particular ethnic group. So for example, paramount chief can be asked by a president, among the candidates we have here, which one of them is your choice to be a county commissioner? When the paramount chief says, in your list, this is my choice, the president will go with it. And that's the relevance of the seat of the paramount chief, that it shapes an opinion. And when it comes to elections, and by the way, we're in the favor of implementing an agreement that is ending with elections. When it comes to election, that particular figure called paramount chief play a big role in shaping the opinion of the voters about the candidates that want to contest. So it will become a big debate that particular seat, can we co-share, or can we have an opportunity of also having a voice or having an authority, or can we share the authority to shape the opinion of the public? That's how the tension started, because also that it informs the seat of the commissioner, which is a local government administrator or a political figure at local government level. But at the same time also, it shapes the governor if you want to appoint ministers that come from that particular ethnic background. That's the importance of having the paramount chief position. And I will tell you, even it interferes with religious setups. The opinion of religious leaders sometimes are so much influenced by the role of so-called paramount chief, which is completely ahead of traditional authority in that particular locality. So it plays a big role in informing the youth, in shaping public opinion. And I think that have somehow been disputed, that it's been biased if it is one ethnic group dominant. But as I said, it is an inherited in the case of Tombura. It's not an appointed or it's not an elected. It's an inherited by nature, by history.
From the last report, it appeared that the paramount chief, who's from Azande, had escaped attack and he had fled to the jungle. Where is he now?
He's still outside. He's not in the town of Tombura. He's still in hideouts. Why? Because he regularly comes under attack. As equal as a county commissioner, is also regularly coming under attack in his house. 2 days ago, the house of the county commissioner was attacked. So the National Security Service have to repel the attackers, which you can term them, or normally in the language that you can hear from Tombura right now on the ground, they say it is armed Balanda youth which attacked the house of the commissioner. So, and that is still becoming problematic, that the seat of the paramount chief, which is the head of traditional authority in Tombura County, is disputed. The seat of the county commissioner is disputed. So any political administrative seat, whether at traditional authority level or at local government level, is always contested and is under attack. So that's why I see any attack that happened in Tombura town is either the site where the paramount chief, or the site where the commissioner is, or the site where James Nando is. So it become more of elites fighting over responsibility in terms of administration of Tombura County.
Now, Chief Sebit Cornelio, the interim Balanda chief in Tombura County, has he showed any interest in trying to unseat the Azande paramount chief?
He have no any public physical evidence that you can prove that he's trying to unseat or is trying to take over that. But in terms of debate and authority, yes, as a democratic principle and democratic practices, that always it is a question of, like, we are two different ethnic groups. Can we share shaping of an opinion? That's a democratic principles, which I don't think it means unseating the seat of the paramount chief. I've never done that. And also he's been complaining several times that the Balandas have been discriminated in the administration of Tombura. And even during the crisis, I remember I spoke to him one time, he told me a vehicle is leaving Tombura and Balandas were sort of like offloaded from the vehicles and they were taken for questioning. And he said, look here, and this is in one of a humanitarian vehicle car, which I don't want to mention the humanitarian agent for the principle of remaining objective and neutral, because I don't think we need to blame humanitarian actors here in terms of the objectivity, their objective. But the chief was telling me this is happening, that his tribe mates are being discriminated and sometimes they're targeted.
Reports indicate that the Azande and Balana tribes are arming themselves extensively to engage in prolonged conflict. Where are they getting the weapons from and who is behind them, supporting them? I know you mentioned there are political elites who are fueling the conflict, but can you name names? I know last time you did not want to name names, but how about now?
One thing that I don't want to specifically give you, but what I will do is that the two parties who are in conflict in South Sudan, and that on I will level the IO and SSPDF. There are players behind the IO and SSPDF that it's beyond one individual that are really supplying and fueling the tensions on the ground that you can see. For example, in the side of the Zandes, always you come to hear, there's so much names around General Nando, which that, oh, you know, he's fueling the Zandes, arming the Zandes, but of course, you can't see that physical. And at the same time, the dilemma is that when you hear somebody like James Nando, his forces are based in Tombura, and he's supposed to be reintegrated into SSPDF in Moridi, but logistical wise, he couldn't move out of Tombura to join his base where he's supposed to be integrated in Meridi. And if you see the IOs are in Namtina. And most of the arguments that Namtina is not a legal cantonment site for the IO. The IO have to move to Rilango. For them to move to Rilango, still they need logistics. So logistics are not there. So both parties, the SPLA-IO and the SSPDF, have to be blamed for actual arming the two groups on an ethnic line for proxy war.
Now, what are the logistical problems that are in place that are preventing the movement of the soldiers, the forces?
If you listen to the leadership of the JDB, the Joint Defense Box, which actually, it was led by one of IO commanders called Willie Bear. Willie Bear is the one heading that. He's one of the IO commanders in the eastern side of Western Equatoria Countess in Muntri. If you talk to him, you will hear he say, I have the plans, I have everything, but unfortunately, I don't have vehicles to move the forces. What he did, the only thing that he did is about 2 trucks or 3 trucks that moves the IO, where I describe them as women and children mainly, not actually the actual soldiers of the IO, that they say IO have been reallocated, but actually what I've said is that mostly it's women and children that were being reallocated. They still, the armed groups of IO are around Tombura. And if you come to SSPDF in terms of James Nando, SSPDF to relocate James Nando under the JDB arrangement out of Tombura to Meridi is a long distance. And also you come to hear that we don't have trucks, we're waiting for the trucks, we don't have fuel. And actually even the forces of JDB who are on the ground in Tombura have to call for reinforcement because they feel they're under attack of both parties if things turn to a worse situation in Tombura. So they call for reinforcement. As we're speaking with you today, we had there's a more reinforcement from SSPDF been sent to Tombura to really calm down the situation. So the question we have to ask is, if reinforcement can reach Tombura, why not to move those forces out of Tombura? Where are the vehicles and the fuel that was able to be found and used for reinforcing forces to Tombura? But why not the same vehicle, the same fuel can be used to demilitarize Tombura by reallocating the IO and the Nando forces? So the question is it real logistics or it's a lack of political will among the parties who are in proxy war? So it's a question of political will. I don't think it's a question of logistics. But obviously, if you ask JDB, they'll tell you it's a logistical question.
What is the estimated number of forces related to SPLA-IO and as well as SSPDF?
The numbers are big. The numbers are beyond 3,000 to 4,000 boots on the ground. The number is big because it's whole Nando force, which you can estimate it's beyond 5,000 boots, and Kwaso IOs you can estimate beyond that. The lowest you can estimate is 2,000 on the ground. But as you have mentioned in the beginning of your interview, in the middle of your interview, that the two groups that are fighting on the ground are arming themselves. What does that mean? It means we're going to see more arms on the ground. So the numbers that I've mentioned might have increased in the recent days as mobilization and reinforcement is going on the ground.
On Wednesday, October 13th, General James Nando, who defected from SPLA-IO and joined SSPDF in 2020, had an exchange of gunfire between his forces and those loyal to Angelo Davido. What happened that day, and where is General Nando now? Also, what is the governor of Western Equatoria State, Governor Alfred Futuyo, doing about the situation in the state that he's supposed to govern?
What happened is that James Nando on that particular day, according to his own sources, said his wife was being operated and he need to leave Tombura. And he want to see his wife out of Tombura, he want to go to Ezo. So on his way, he falls under 3 ambushes, and the ambushes are laid by the forces that are loyal or under the command of Angelo Davido. And Angelo Davido was attacking him because he feels like maybe he is going to seek for reinforcement. So where he is now, he's out of Tombura, in the site of Ezo, because according to James Nando, he say he is coming to see his wife who's been operated. But what we're getting from the authorities on the ground is that he is escaping Tombura and he falls under 3 consistent ambushes. Actually, even his car was attacked to the level that he have to leave his car and walk into the bushes and he spent night on the bushes. But his reinforcement went and fixed the car and moved to his side. So as I say, this is the dilemma of the situation in Tombura, of whether the information we're getting from the fighting forces is true or not. But what the reality is that confrontation is going on the ground between forces under the command of Angelo Davido against James Nando, who is commanding his forces, who are more supposed to be integrated into SSPDF.
Now, you mentioned that Angelo Davido has militia who are partly Balanda as well as Azande. Is Governor Futuyo supporting Angelo Davido?
He have not declared an open supporting of Angelo Davido. I met him, and in my interview with him, he shows me how Angelo Davido is deploying around Tombura and how risky that it is in terms of peace and stability in Tombura. But of course, the question is, what is he doing? Which goes back to part of your question. What is he doing as a governor of the state to see peace and stability? I feel effective engagement of the honorable governor in controlling the situation in Tombura, it's really weak. Sort of like the situation in Tombura is left for intervention of the national government. And specifically when the JDB was deployed on the ground to handle this situation, it's sort of like it reduced the strength of the governor. So if you meet Honorable Governor Futuyo, he will tell you the situation on the ground in Tombura, it requires the elites who are based in Juba to lift their fingers from fueling the problem. That's always his position in my meetings with him. He will tell me, look here, it is the political elites who are both Balandas and Zandes based in Juba, supplying ammunition. That's the way, that's his interpretation to the ground. But when I ask, what about your strengths? What is your role? What is your responsibility as a governor to ensure Tombura is peaceful? He say it is until when the national government intervene. So sort of like if you speak to him, you feel like he tells you, my fingers are controlled. That's a top security issue that as a state governor can't interfere. It requires the national government to intervene. But the question is, what is happening at the level of national government as to rescue the situation in Tombura? There's nothing. It's only JDB on the ground and giving an excuse. We don't have logistics at national level. It is directives for enforcement on the ground, but not demilitarizing Tombura town.
Mm-hmm. Does President Kiir plan to convene an urgent meeting to bring those leaders to account who are fueling the conflict in Western Equatoria State? And from our last interview, you mentioned that Governor Futuyo had not responded to President Kiir's call for him to come to Juba. Has Governor Futuyo agreed to meet with the president, or has he already met with the president?
After our interview, he responded. He came to Juba. He had a couple of meetings in Juba with the leadership, and later on he returned back to Yambio. So President Kiir have called him several times for meetings, and even not only President Kiir, even First Vice President Riek Machar have called him for a couple of meetings. But unfortunately, what is happening, and it's confusing, is that out of those meetings, the decision made, you find the following morning they have been countered on the ground. And that makes you start asking whether the principles in personality of His Excellency the President or His Excellency the President really have taken responsibility to follow the outcomes of their meetings being executed by the governor and the deputy governor, because also there's a political confrontation between the governor and the deputy governor, in the sense that the governor is an SPLA-IO in a state that by then it is sort of like territorially controlled by the SPLM incumbent, which is now taking the seat of the deputy governorship. So that protocol issue between the governor and the deputy governor, that political friction between the governor and the deputy governor, itself, it contributes in undermining the strengths of the state of Western Equatoria State in controlling the situation in Tombura. That means that president and first vice president, who are principal of the IO and the SPLM, are they playing a very effective role to ensure that their subordinates at the state level ensure safety and protection of civilians as a priority? My assessment is they're not doing enough on that particular trend.
What was the outcome of part of the meetings between Governor Futuyo and President Kiir, as well as Governor Futuyo and Dr. Riek Machar?
Most of their meetings outcomes are around demilitarizing Tombura. Is that relocate the force of James Nando out of Tombura to SSPDF Division 6 command base in Meridi, and move IO out of Namtina to Ilangu. That's always. And that requires the two principles to execute that particular outcome. And second, they call for the political elites to constitute dialogue. What we see is that we have seen political elites going to the ground, and the opposite, whenever political elites goes to the ground, the trend of the violence increases. So the question is, have they gone to prevent violence, or have they gone to fuel violence? This is always what happened. But unfortunately, we have seen no official open statement from His Excellency the President or His Excellency First Vice President speaking as a personal leader that want to address the case of Tombura. We don't see that coming from them. And there's silence at national level. Even at the level of the National Legislative Assembly, it's only during the Inaugural Assembly, it's the Speaker who spoke about Tombura case. But the parliamentarians who are at national level, who comes from Tombura, being at Balanda or Zandes, we have never seen them raising emotion, or any national MP raising emotion in national parliament that let us look at Tombura issue. And that's why we're trying to lobby, we're trying to push. At least next week, we expect to influence the parliament to raise emotion over that issue. So at national level, there's a less attention towards Tombura situation.
Yes, during our last interview, you mentioned the Joint Defense Board was going to travel to Western Equatoria State to investigate the current crisis in the region. You also stated that the process of demilitarization of Tombura is slow, given the rising scale of conflict. What is the government and the stakeholders doing to resolve the situation? And so far, it seems like the Joint Defense Board is really slow when it comes to the process of demilitarization. Therefore, what is the objective in being in Western Equatoria State? Because they seem to be ineffective in performing their duties.
Yes, they're really ineffective in performing their duties, and they're ineffective because financially they're not being supported enough. Logistical, they've been not supported enough by the central government. And that tells you whether at national level, there are national players who entertain violence to continue in Tombura, because that ineffectiveness of JDB, it's not really the leadership of the JDB on the ground. It is the central authority that sends the JDB on the ground. Then they have not sent them with enough resources that will cover logistical and will make them execute the decision so quickly. So their presence in Tombura, it's really challenging. And I had quite a number of debates with leaders of the community, like chiefs from Zande and Balanda, were telling me, Edmund, why is there JDB on the ground and still we have gunshots in the front of the JDB forces? And the following morning, they don't act. You don't see them effectively moving. And when talk to the JDB, they say, we are limited. Our capacity is limited. We are ineffective because we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough logistics to execute decisions. So also, JDB is caught up in a situation where they're delegated to execute a mandate that it's not been funded and not been facilitated logistical wise.
On September 19th, a joint press statement was released by IGAD, RJMEC, representatives of the African diplomatic community, Norway, and UNMISS on the situation in Tombura. The press statement read, "A joint delegation of international partners to the peace process in South Sudan visited Tombura, Western Equatoria State on 16 September 2021 to encourage peaceful solutions to the conflict that has led to the killings and injuring of civilians, the displacement of over 80,000 people, destruction of private and public property, and the suspension of humanitarian operations." The delegation concluded that unless urgent action is taken by the revitalized transitional government of national unity to end the fighting, there is an imminent risk that further escalation will endanger vulnerable populations, exacerbate the dire humanitarian situation, and threaten successful implementation of the 2018 revitalized agreement on the resolution of conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. From engagements with the local stakeholders, it became clear that the root causes of the conflict can only be addressed through full implementation of the agreement, and most urgently, the unification of forces and their deployment. Apart from the conflict in Western Equatoria State, in Warrap State, the communities in Tonj East and Tonj North have been engaged in intense fighting this month, which left 36 people dead and countless injured. What fueled the conflict in Warrap State?
You know, the situation in Warrap between the Lunjang and the Marialo communities of Tonj North and Tonj East, it described the same situation in Tombura. The only difference that Tombura you have two different ethnic groups, but in Tonj you have one ethnic group, Dinka, but sections are fighting among themselves in the division between the two locations of Tombura North, Tonj North and Tonj East. It is a deadly fighting. And the challenging situation in Tonj is that two communities are fighting in between Tonj North and Tonj East in the face of the floods. So imagine a situation where you displaced over 5,000 residents into floods, and where the highlands that are supposed to accommodate this population who have lost their shelters or their housing, you're using it for executing active armed fighting among the communities. So the situation of Tonj is really very tough. As we're speaking, Payuna, as you have mentioned, 37 people were killed, 80 were injured. And out of 8, some of them have been airlifted to Akobo for medical treatment in Jongole. And over 5,000 residents have been displaced. Over 80 houses have been burned. And this is in the face of very heavy floods. These have led to the following consequences. The number of snake bites among the communities have increased. In 1 week, 24 snake bites were registered. And we have lost life out of those 24. And we have these 5,000 households that have been displaced, are in dire humanitarian need in terms of shelter, medication, mosquito nets from the mosquitoes that may come, or in general waterborne diseases, besides humanitarian assistance in terms of food. So Tonj is a double shot on the population.
What fueled the conflict within the state?
It's also mainly because I've been on the ground. I've been in Kwajok to really understand what is happening between Tonj North and Tonj East. Still also I 08, it's politically motivated by the elites who are from Tonj North and Tonj East, who are based in Juba. Some of them are based in the state capital in Kwajok, fueling this tension. Because ask yourself, how come people are fighting in front of the floods and the national army in terms of SSPDF are unable to respond because logistical wise, they can't drive, their vehicles can't move to prevent the conflict. But the youth and who are running between Tonj North and Tonj East are actively killing themselves. The bullets, where do they get from? The rifles they're using, where do they get from? So we have developed this tendency where political elites that need access to power, they start investing in creating armed violence among our communities, and they use that as an opportunity to be heard by the president And if the president gives them the ears, they are not resolving the problem. They will use the violence to beg for power by saying, governor have failed, please appoint me as a governor. I will resolve that situation.
It was not long ago that a meeting was convened between the two sub-clans to resolve the issues that they have. And it appears that the meeting was not effective because now there's a continuation of conflict, but at a larger scale compared to previously.
Yes, yes. And this is a clear indicator how the elites, which are either at national level or at the state level. And when I say these elites at national level or state level, these elites are embedded in the national security institutions, in the national military institutions, in the national political institutions, and they use their powers in those offices to fuel the violence. So the question comes in is, at national level, who are really watching at these political elites that are fueling the violence? So there's a tendency whenever you reconcile communities, and if the reconciliation is not giving a return to the political elites access to power, they undermine. It's the same thing that happening in Tombura. Communities met, I was there, we reached resolutions. 3 weeks, there's a stability. Later on, political elites went to the ground and the violence picked up again in large scale. It's the same thing between Tonj North and Tonj East.
As the executive director of CEPO, have you addressed the ongoing conflict in Tombura and Warrap State with the national parliament? If so, how far have you gone along in really talking to them about this particular issue?
Obviously, we have lobbied them. We have lobbied them as national parliamentarians, and I will share with you that we have reached out consensus with some MPs this week that next week they raise a motion in the national parliament to have a particular dedicated parliamentary hearing on the situation in Tombura and between Tonj North and Tonj East. We provide them all necessary evidence, all necessary information that it aid them to raise a parliamentary motion summoning the executives to explain what is going on. At the same time, mobilizing the parliament to make a decision of what is the best intervention they can take up.
Who are the parliamentarians that you lobbied to advocate for the issues in the states?
Quietly, they have a big number. I couldn't really call them all, but there are some parliamentarians who are for the Tombura, we lobby parliamentarians who are non-Zande, non-Balandas, who are national, and specifically parliamentarians from Jongole and parliamentarians from Upper Nile. We have lobbied them, quite a number of them. And we have met with them and we have provided them with information. They have agreed that they will take up that. And for the situation of Tonj North and Tonj East, we lobbied the parliamentarians who are sons and daughters of Warrap. And we have reached out to quite a number of Equatorians. That means the West, the Central Equatorians, and the Eastern Equatoria parliamentarians, quite a number of them, we have lobbied them. So they're big in number. I can't call out the names one by one, but at least we have reached to over, out of 660, we have reached to over 50 parliamentarians.
We've been joined on the program by Mr. Edmund Yakani, the Executive Director of CEPO. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, too.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube page at Sunrise Media.